CCCR, or Centre for Creative and Cultural Research, investigates the ancient, innovative relationship between social culture and creative production. Based in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra, we generate scholarship and artwork in a wide array of humanities, social science, applied and creative disciplines. You are listening to a fresh presentation from the CCCR's Culture and Creativity Seminar Series. To learn more about the Centre's work, please follow the links in the program notes. This podcast was recorded on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri peoples.
Hi everybody, my name's Paul McGee. I'm the Director of the Centre for Creative and Cultural Research here in the Faculty of Arts and Design at the University of Canberra. I want to start by acknowledging that we are on the unceded lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I want to pay my respects to all Aboriginal people present and especially to all elders past and present. Today it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Louw. Mike is a senior lecturer in architecture at the University of Canberra School of Design and the Built Environment. Prior to this, he taught full-time at the University of Cape Town for 10 years, following 12 years in practice in South Africa and the United Kingdom. Mike holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree from the University of Pretoria, an MPhil degree in Sustainable Development Planning and Management from the University of Stellenbosch, and a PhD in Architecture from the University of Cape Town. His research focuses on architectural technology, adaptation, design build practice, sustainable and low carbon material use, and tectonics. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thanks, Paul. Hi, everyone. So in terms of the topic architecture in and out of time, the climate crisis is shifting the way in which we should be thinking about time in architecture. So this presentation considers time as a lens through which to look at some practice-based research that we did here at UC towards the end of last year. And not just in relation to material life cycles, but also in terms of the perception of movement and change. So I'm originally from Namibia. As Paul said, I spent most of my life in South Africa or Southern Africa. But Namibia is where I was born and where I grew up initially. And one of its natural wonders is a place called the Skeleton Coast. So it's where the Dune Sea meets the Atlantic Ocean. A really amazing place. It's famous for its shipwrecks, but also for the so-called Brulduine, which translates roughly to roaring dunes. So these dunes are quite amazing. There's a audiographer who made recordings of them using microphones above ground and hydrophones below ground, so underwater microphones that he pushed deep into the dunes to try and record the sound. So above ground, you hear the obvious wind howling across the dune surface and the sand coming across when you're sitting on them. But deep down, there's a type of groan or rumbling, which once you get used to the recordings, you can access them on his website. It really starts making you aware of movement and change. So it's really giving you a sense that these things are moving without you really being aware of it. So one can sort of equate it to the idea of climate change, where we're often aware of extreme climate events or floods or fires, but underground, there's a sort of rumbling going on that we're not always perceiving necessarily. So just before I get to the practice-based research, I just thought I'd talk through a few conceptions of time. So Bodenhammer and Hall in their Adventures with Timelines stratify time into different cognitive layers. So I'll maybe just highlight a few of them. So the first one is natural time. So natural time refers to the cycles of the sun and the moon and natural cycles, which obviously also influence organisms in terms of our circadian rhythms and so on, but they're also really important to things like agriculture. And ancient civilizations were especially keen to be aware of how those cycles change because they were crucial to life. So many structures were built to track them, which we all know, Stonehenge and Hatshepsut's temple, for example, but also places like Chanquillo in Peru. Really interesting. And more contemporary architects have also used natural cycles or the sun to influence the form of the buildings that they designed. So really looking at natural cycles to determine form. So Greg Lynn's house, H2 house in Austria is an example of that, but there are also many others. And then time as a cultural construct also has a long history. So Charles Jenks and Yusuke Maki believed that time was qualitative for many older civilizations, especially in relation to ritual, which also relates to natural cycles quite often. So time in the Judeo-Christian sense is typically linear, whereas in Hinduism and Buddhism it tends to be more cyclical. And then Ryszard Kapuscinski, who wrote many books on Africa, argued that time in Africa is more elastic and is often influenced by the actions of people, so it's more subjective. So the ancient Greeks differentiated between these two concepts, chronos and kairos. So chronos obviously is where words like chronology comes from, so it's quantitative, whereas kairos sort of translates to the opportune moment or the right time, which is more subjective or qualitative. And then our conception of time also changed in the last century from absolute time, which Plato and Aristotle believed in, to relative time. So the architectural theorist Siegfried Gideon talks about how the changing perception of space and time influenced the futurists and the cubists, and they tried to represent this change in movement using techniques like simultaneity in their work to try and represent movement and change. In architecture specifically, movement was often used as a tool to make people more aware of time. So especially in something that's often referred to as the architectural promenade. I wrote a paper on that many years ago, and one of its key adherents is the famous architect Le Corbusier, who worked with it a lot. So the promenade can help architects to emphasize or heighten the experience of time, either by making people who move through a building to perceive time as passing slower or faster. So there are lots of interesting methods that we use. This drawing is one of Le Corbusier's drawings for a pavilion called the Pavilion of New Times, which was built, a temporary building built in 1937. So it takes viewers through a sort of promenade to the future and the past, but it begins at what he called the architectural revolution accomplished, and it ends with a rough translation being recognition of the true program of machine civilization, which is quite interesting, thinking how the world is shifting now in terms of AI and digitization. But happily, it also mentions the first stop, which is the 24-hour solar day, which will be relevant later. So I thought I'd just take you through a quick promenade through some things I've written about in the past and some projects that I was involved with before getting to the promise practice-based research here at UC. So maybe firstly, an interesting way of thinking about time is through technological time. So it obviously relates to climate change, low carbon design, global local hybridization, and sustainable material use. So maybe just to go back to Namibia for a few seconds. So this is a bracelet I bought for my partner many years ago in Namibia. It is made by people from the Himba tribe. So the Himba tribe typically lives in the far northwestern corner of Namibia and southern Angola. And it's quite a traditional looking bracelet. It has traditional engravings and patterns inked on them. And it sort of vaguely looks like ivory, but we don't do that anymore. So this is actually, when I asked what it was made out of, it is a drainage pipe. So it got me wondering, how does a UPVC drainage pipe, most likely made in China, end up in the far northwestern corner of Namibia to be rescripted into traditional jewelry? So I find that really fascinating, and I think it's what David Edgerton refers to as clashes of technological time, which also intrigued me. So that probably ended up as one of the starting points of my PhD, the University of Cape Town, where I went on a search for what I called hybrid tectonics in contemporary African architecture, where I really looked at buildings, contemporary buildings, where architects tried to hybridize global and local ways of making. So on the global side, global materials or methods of making were often industrialized or mass-produced things that were dependent on global supply chains, often also digitization or digital ways of making. And on the local side, mostly bio-based materials, sometimes reused, repurposed, or recycled materials, usually driven by limitations. But it wasn't only about where these things were from or how they were made or processed. It was really about the underpinning value systems, the value systems that underpin them, or what they represented. So again, looking at a few artists and architects who use this underlying meaning or these underpinning values or meanings in some of their work. So again, one can think about it as embodied time or embodied meaning, but also in relation to embodied carbon. So a good example is an artist called El Anatsui, born in Ghana, but practices in Nigeria. So he's famous for these textiles that he makes, what he calls sheets. So they can be really big. This one I photographed at the Zeitz Maka Gallery in Cape Town. It's over 15 meters tall and 25 meters wide. So it's really large. But the remarkable thing about it is that it's made out of recycled liquor caps. So these found objects for El Anatsui weren't like Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades. For him, it's about the human touch and the embodied memory or meaning that's embedded in these liquor caps, almost like human DNA that keeps staying with these objects, even when their meaning is re-scripted or when they're used for something else. Architects like Amateur Architecture Studio from China, Wang Shu and Louw were also concerned about the social and cultural capital that was being lost with the demolition of older buildings, especially Hutong neighborhoods in China. So they harvested some of those materials and used them in some of their buildings, like the Ningbo Art Museum. They're a really amazing building, and you can still read some of the materiality of the old Hutong neighborhoods in its walls, but also how the building simulates the experience of the alleyways and streetways of the old Hutongs. I also tried a few things like that. This was with Team Mahali, where we entered a temporary building into the Solar Decathlon in Morocco quite a few years ago. So I came across ladies, mostly single mothers outside Cape Town, who were using recycled plastic bags to crochet placemats or little baskets. So we thought it would be interesting to get them to expand their practice. So we managed to siphon most of the funding towards them so they could crochet these panels out of recycled plastic bags so we could wrap a building in them, sort of like a big pullover. So it was a temporary building, so we weren't too concerned about microplastics being released over time, but it was still an interesting experiment to see how one can re-script things and sort of sequester plastic in a way before doing something else with it until we figure out what else to do with it. Another way to embed meaning would be through adaptive reuse practice, like repurposing or retrofitting or reusing older buildings. So I was fortunate enough to work on quite a few industrial adaptive reuse projects when I was still in practice. This was an old power station that we turned into a hotel. So obviously there were advantages in terms of embodied carbon, in terms of cost saving. In South Africa, a big advantage in terms of additional labor required because there's lots of unemployment there. So labor was a big bonus for us. But really the most important thing or the most revealing thing was the social and cultural capital that these buildings had, especially in smaller communities. So a lot of the former factory workers and people who worked in the building were reskilled into hospitality. So the stories they told and how they used those buildings were some of the most interesting things we came across. A lot of those people told how they were drying their clothes in front of the boilers that ran on leftover sawdust from a timber sawmill, and lots of other really interesting stories. And the same back to the Zeitz Maka Museum, which was an old grain silo, once the tallest building in Africa, which was turned into this art museum. And they had to cast new concrete sleeves into the old silo walls to be able to carve out or hollow out the internal atrium. So in the building itself, you can start reading the layers of past and present in the different layers of old and new concrete, because one could never get concrete exactly the same. The aggregates change, the cement changes, the coloring changes, everything is different. So you can read those layers of embodied time in the fabric of the building. Another way of reading time in architecture is either through weathering, sometimes through constant renewal. It also begs the question why we're still making buildings to last 100 years when they're often demolished after 30 years. So should we reconsider how we make them to allow for weathering? Or should we make them so that they can be constantly renewed or disassembled, designing for disassembly, for instance? So an example of weathering in buildings, this is 17 Glen in Cape Town, designed by Studio Mass. It was a building designed specifically to be taken over by nature and to allow for multi-species cohabitation. There were holes in the walls for bats to inhabit, and it's already much more overgrown than it does in this image. On the other hand, constant renewal, that was often really important to moving or nomadic civilizations. Also in buildings like the Ise Jingu Shrine in Japan, which is pretty much entirely rebuilt every 20 or so years on an identical adjacent site. And also like the Great Mosque of Jannah in Mali. This building gets reclayed every year to keep it alive. It kind of cracking and the extreme weather conditions needed to be reclayed and refinished once a year. It's probably still the largest extant clay building in the world. But this annual reclaying ceremony is really important in terms of ritual and bringing community together. And some of the features in the building, those timber elements sticking out, they're both for reinforcement, but also to allow for scaffolding and ladders to be put up every year. So they're literally designed for constant renewal. But this reclaying ceremony, interesting thing about it is that the mosque itself is changing over time, and the very fabric it's made from is changing. So the author Trevor Marchand writes that the laterite excavated near town tends to contain a high content of refuse, and this makes its way rather directly into bricks and gets churned up in the mortar. Shards of glass, rusting tin cans, plastics, packaging, rags, cigarette cartons, dried animal dung, discarded batteries, bones, and even old bicycle chains are encased daily in JNA's new walls. So due to the impact of humans and change, the very fabric of this mosque is changing over time. So if we were to take a section through it, like Moore showed us last week in the CCCR presentation, you would be able to read climate change within the wall of the building, which would be quite fascinating, actually. So over to some practice-based research here at UC. So how to translate all of that stuff into practice-based research at UC? Well, first you invite some friends. So this is some work I did with a great collaborative team with Sally Farah, Max Maxwell, Sam Tompkins, and our two fantastic postgrad research assistants, Noah Watson and Jonathan Lechung. I did see Noah here earlier. So we were looking to engage with some of the policies and guidelines in the ACT related to urban heat island effects and shading and residential design. So we came up with this idea of exploring bioclimatic wraps for existing buildings for climate resilient housing to respond to climate change and the urban heat island effect. So it's not an architectural project per se, it's a collocation of different research trajectories in terms of representation, digitization, and material prototyping. So there's quite a few different things running at the same time. And just a few acknowledgements. So the research was funded by the Alistair Swain Foundation through a design strategy grant and also through the Faculty of Arts and Design's Emerging Researcher grant. Also, we made a lot of use from Workshop 7 and worked in close collaboration with Paul Shelley and Sam Shellard from Workshop 7, which was really great. And Nick Burrows, one of the Workshop 7 staff, helped us with some really nice photographs. We also made one prototype in collaboration with UTS's AFRL, which I'll show you later. And then also just thanks to the Canberra Accommodation Centre. So climate change requires us to change the things we've already made and designed and to change the way we design and make things. So different authors guess that the built environment is responsible for 37 to 39% of global carbon emissions. So that's a really important issue. And with a target of 43% greenhouse gas emission reductions by 2030 in Australia and net zero by 2050, one could ask the question, are we running out of time? So a few things we were looking at implementing. The first one was a cradle-to-cradle approach. So that's where you consider materials either as part of a biological nutrient cycle or a technical nutrient cycle. So the biological nutrient cycle is typically if you use bio-based materials that you harvest, process, use, and then once they've used at the end of life, they get composted and become biological nutrients again. So this is almost related to the idea of weathering and time. And on the other side, the technical cycle is where you harvest or mine materials, they get processed, used, and at the end of their life, they can be reused or repurposed or recycled again to go back into a technical nutrient cycle. So that relates more to the idea of constant renewal. So we knew we wanted to work with a cradle-to-cradle approach. We wanted to use bio-based materials. If we can't, then reused, repurposed, or recycled materials. So in terms of low carbon design, besides doing nothing or not building anything, the next best strategy for carbon reduction is adaptive reuse or retrofitting. So we definitely wanted to engage with that. Building facades are responsible for 15% of upfront embodied carbon. So we thought combining those two aspects would be a good start for decarbonization. Also, using an existing building meant we didn't have to invent everything from scratch. So it helped a little bit. So we aimed for the Gowrie Hostel in Northbourne Avenue for a number of reasons. And then we came up with this idea of a bioclimatic wrap that's kinetic, that could move. First off, the idea was to add some balconies, 1.5 meters deep, both to provide shading from the northern sun, but also to encourage community interaction. It's a very cellular building, so to open that up, to improve community, to allow space for plants to grow, where animals could sit, and then to add this skin of what we called flax wings eventually, that could open and close automatically. So the idea was to use sensors that they react to solar input or thermal input. So when the sun shines on them, or if it gets particularly hot, that they would close automatically. And when it's cooler or when there's shade from other buildings or trees, that they would open automatically. So again, it relates to the idea of Chronos and Kairos. So quantitative in terms of you being able to read the natural cycle, but also qualitative or at the right time, where the users could also control them. So the other idea we had was if they could react to movement or proximity, or we users could control themselves. So in terms of proximity, we thought if you get closer to them, they could open. If you move further, they could close. And also it relates to Le Corbusier's idea of a house as a machine for living in. And again, one could ask why, with all the other machines around us, why are buildings lagging so far behind in relation to other machines? So then we decided on the materials to use. Like I said, we wanted to use bio-based materials as far as possible. So we settled on flax. It's a really amazing material, and it has very good mechanical properties. But also we had some left over from a previous research project, so we did want to use it. And then after lots of head scratching and designing to come up with the mechanism and how the material reacts, and to figure out how the structure could work, we made lots of little prototypes and models to test everything. And then also used computational design, topological optimization to really optimize the structure of the wings, to add folds or additional flax reinforcement where most of the stresses would be. And Noah and Max were really very good with this stuff. So it went through a few iterations as well until we settled on the final version, after which we could start with a 1-to-1 scale prototype. So we used 2 timber doors, which we then took to workshop 7 and used CNC cutting to make the mold, to cut out the mold. We then applied some pigmented bioresin to the molds and some wax layers and some polyvinyl alcohol release agent, after which we could start laying up different layers of flax. And those were then rolled up with more bioresin and vacuum bagged, after which we could take them out and do the wing assembly. So we managed to get the 1-to-1 scale wings together, and with the normal window actuator that worked on a little motor, they could open and close by themselves. So usually we don't like to show our first prototypes. We usually like to do a few iterations, but we were quite pleased that we got it to work. And also it allowed us to test the strength, the rigidity, the weight, and translucency, and all those sort of things. And we exhibited the work with all the smaller prototypes here at UC, which some of you kindly attended. Thank you. And also we used some hybrid modes of representation. So using 1.2D perspectives combined with an augmented representation of the wings that reacted to proximity. So some of the displays were interactive. So this was an interior view of one of the rooms. And if you walk closer to the screen, the wings would open. We also had little table tennis paddles fixed to them with audio sensors. So if you took the paddle close to the audio sensor, the wings would open for you. And we made an abstract model of the Gowrie Hostel, which worked in a similar way. So there was a audio sensor on the front block, which if you got close to it, the wings on the rear block opened up. So we also tried a few other prototypes. So this was done in collaboration with the University of Technology of Sydney's Advanced Fabrication Robotic Lab, where we used wool on their 3D knitting machine to make a pair of 1:1 scale wings, just to test if that would work. So we'd like to do another version of that. So this one we called Knitwing 1.0. We'd like to do a second version. And we'd also like to do a Flaxwing 2.0 using less flax and bioresin, using a 3D printed knitting machine in Workshop 7 that Max and Sam put together, with a more open weave, also with bioresin, to reduce the weight and make more efficient use of the materials too. So I think just to end, in order to change the way we design and make things, I think we need to become more aware of nature or country, and more aware of change, and most importantly, more aware of time. I think that's it.
Thanks so much, Mike. Great to get that conceptual tour of buildings and time, and then to see all this stuff enacted in your work here. I'm going to open the floor for questions and comments. Any questions or comments? Denise?
Thank you so much, Mike. It's a really fascinating project. I know nothing about architecture, but I love the way you started, particularly with these different notions of time. And I just had a question about, I guess, time and automation, and the way in which the design being driven by sensors and something that can sort of respond to our movement in the space. Whether you've considered, I guess, in the climate that we're in right now, some of the anxieties around automation as an acceleration of time. And if you think integrating that into homes and stuff like that, shifts again our perception of time. Or
I think a big thing is to still allow for user control, so that people can customize it to their own needs and desires. So there are a few things that's frustrating as being in a building where the windows can't open for me. I'm not a big fan of air conditioning. So I think that user control is important. I think the other thing is there was a lot of writing and talk around slow architecture, which is similar to the slow food movement, where it's not just about the sourcing of materials and the processing of it, but in the way the conviviality around it and how you use it, or how the sensory perception of food and architecture are sort of similar. So I think in terms of slowness, yes, I think definitely that would be a good link.
Thank you.
Bethany?
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Mike. Such a fantastic presentation, and I loved the visuals. So thank you.
Thank you.
I too want to talk about time. I too know nothing about architecture, so we're getting off on a good start here.
I know a lot about it.
I think from your presentation, I kind of get the sense that, and I mean, this is related to the work I do in a very different area, but that one of the key challenges is how diverse human and more than human temporalities can cohabitate, how we can do that in a convivial way. And I guess thinking about time, obviously is non-linear, as you pointed out, in both multiple human ways of thinking, but also for the more than humans. And just on the mobility thing that Denise raised, I was thinking when talking about sensors, it's kind of like, well, what happens about it's responding to the humans, but what about the birds? What about the other interactions that might occur with those sensors? And how do these things get incorporated into the process? And obviously you talked about the lawns and the animals have places to sit, but I'm super interested in that temporality aspect of the more than human.
Yeah, there's a lot of work being done on multi-species cohabitation or cross-species cohabitation, which is really interesting. How you can design buildings. Some of our master students are working with that at the moment. How you can design buildings that can weather by using wall materials that animals could inhabit and that you can then renew over time, and allowing for migratory paths. And it's also with wind turbines, similar concerns around different species and the issues around the things we make in relation to them. I think in terms of time, fortunately and unfortunately, we share our back garden with a possum. And the times when it wants to be very active aren't the times when we want to be very active. So I think learning to coexist is a mind shift that we also need to make, where we tend to try and control nature and keep it out. And I think, again, being more aware of it and allowing it in. So we've given up. We've just put a net around the one thing we don't want it to eat, and otherwise we're sort of sharing the space. But I think it's about sharing the space.
Yeah, learning to live together. Yeah, cool. Thanks, Mike.
Jen.
My question is for myself. Why on earth did I not know what an artist you are?
Oh no,
Beautiful this time. It's wonderful. Pragmatically, is Bill Fontana the sound artist in Namibia?
George Vlad.
George Vlad. Okay,
Yeah.
that's great.
Yeah.
That's great. And otherwise, I just want to say what a wonderful presentation. And I do want to think about how I might deal with my battered old house. So I might talk to you later about that.
Thank you.
I was curious. I know you, did your design of the flex wing on an existing building, and I would be curious about your thoughts around, because you said sort of how, the structures that we have, and as we, modify them or engage with them, they incorporate, new materials over time. And I guess in thinking about our existing, the way that things are constructed now, and adding to them. I guess I'm thinking about if there are things that are constructed poorly, right? Is it something that you've considered or explored around how engaging with those and building upon those kind of navigates that that difficulty of like, well, we have everything that we have here now, and so we have to work with that. We can't just build everything from anew. So with that in mind, like for example, you have these flex wings. If the building itself is not particularly structurally sound, and say an earthquake knocks it down, I guess that's kind of what I'm wondering about. Like, have you considered how to add to that? I don't know if that was a good question.
For sure.
If that made sense.
I think with existing buildings, it's always about what one can value about them. In some cases, it's socio-cultural value. In other cases, it's the value of the structure itself. In other cases, it might be embodied carbon of structure or skin or certain things. It might be historical. It might have been designed by a famous architect or engineer, or it might have been inhabited by a famous person. So what you value in an existing building, I think, is the first step. If the building's quality isn't that good, there are ways to either augment it or provide like a prosthetic, if you want to. Some architects refer to prosthetics or prosthesis, where you strengthen it. In other cases, if it's not good, you could potentially harvest those materials and take them back into the technical nutrient cycle or in the biological one. So I think it's all about what one values in terms of adaptation. Yeah.
Further comments or questions? Yeah, Mike.
Thank you. That was just wonderful. We're sort of about 100 years on from when science has had another look at space and time, where we've had Einstein's general relativity showing that those two things probably are the same thing and they migrate. But what I wanted to turn that question into, it was the same question to Mo last week, is that there's a focus here on decay. And that's only one direction of time, and we know that we can dilate time and such. What I was thinking about was that the materials that you're using are biomass that are decaying, but the other way to approach that is biomass that's growing and living and evolving and reversing time there. And the advantage of doing that, of course, is that you get your carbon capture and you can deal with your climate change. And so have you thought about that different direction of time?
Yeah, it's great. There's a lot of work being done on growing buildings using materials like mycelium. A former colleague of mine, the University of Cape Town, they use to make bricks or grow bricks. And he was also on our team for the Moroccan project. So definitely growing buildings is a very interesting area of study. So yeah, we'd love to experiment with that if we can get some more funding.
Mike, I want to take you back to the quote from Le Corbusier, the reference to a house as a machine for living. And you were suggesting that we haven't been too quick to take up that concept. And, I think, compared to, say, motor cars, where we've hyper-technologized them, whereas in houses, there's been some sort of resistance to that. And I was wondering if about why that might be. And I wonder if it's something about utilitarianism and people not wanting to think in a utilitarian fashion about their home environment. I don't know. So I'm just putting that out there as a thought and wondering what your response is.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's also what maybe partly to do with what the vision of home is. So it's strange that many people still like the look of a traditional or vernacular building, but with things like cars, most people, I would say, or most car designs now are much more advanced in terms of physical appearance, never mind the underpinning technology and engines and things within them. So it's strange. I don't know if it's a thing where people kind of yearn for the idea of home or house or tradition in a home space versus where office buildings, work buildings, cars, other machines, everyone's very happy to embrace newness. I mean, you get retro car designs and people collect old cars and things, but in general, I'm not sure why it's lagging so far behind. Also, the underpinning technology. You get home automation, and we've now got batteries and solar panels, but still, the way they put together, just in terms of the material and construction systems, aren't nearly as optimized as cars or other industries are.
Thank you.
That was absolutely great. And I've got so many questions I'd like to ask you, but I'll start with the superficial one. And that is the form of the wings. They actually look like bat wings, but did you use bird skeletons or any other biological sort of research? And I know they do this in industrial design. They look at nature, and I was wondering if any of the research into getting that shape came from those biological associations.
Not in this case, no. We have, for some of our other things, we've looked at like biomimicry or bird wings and bird bones, especially where you optimize the material use. That sort of relates a bit to the topological optimization, but we didn't specifically look at bird or butterfly wings. It was more just the shape. It's almost if you put a lot of circles together, like in a beehive, if you expand that shape, they tend to naturally go into hexagonal shapes, as an example. So in this case, just the way they fit together so you can invert them in different directions. It was a useful shape, and we made them asymmetrical just because it looked a little bit more interesting that way. Yeah.
Can I ask my second question?
Yeah, and then today's.
Okay, my other question is the phenomenon of wrapping buildings. And certainly with my involvement with heritage, the Macintosh's White House in Helensburgh has been wrapped because of the deterioration from the weather. So it's been seen as a heritage process. It's really to ask you, do you see wrapping buildings as a way of extending the life of successful buildings, buildings that are working? If they were to be wrapped, they'd go from 40 years, 100 years, etc. Or are there more important issues like the sort of the sewerage and water supply and the electricity that actually again determine the life of a building, and how architects, if they were to consider this, that they were doubling or trebling the life of their building by wrapping, would that change the way architects design the sort of the infrastructure?
Yeah, maybe. I think quite a few buildings in Australia make use of double roofs already, and in Africa also, where the one roof is there to shade the other roof and to provide a ventilated space in between. But I think for us, we were thinking about a rise in temperature and climate change. So if you have an existing residential building or house, you could either replace the skin or really try and insulate it on the inside or outside. But then we thought we started with shading, like shade sail almost, or tensile netting, and to create a space, interstitial space also where people can do things. So you create user amenity, but then also protect against heating, increased heating. And then we went through a thought process where we started thinking about fire. How can you make a skin that also protected potentially against fire? So that was sort of where we started, and then it kind of evolved. But we still have lots of other ideas just in terms of shading. And the Macintosh house was definitely one of our precedents that we looked at the beginning. Yeah, thanks, Diane. Yeah.
Oh, it was just sort of building on what Paul had said before. I was just interested as well on that question of the house as machine and whether you felt like there was a sense of what we're comfortable with on the external versus the internal of the home, because I feel as if automation of smart homes, automated air conditioning, all those things we are often quite accustomed to. I mean, I don't have an Alexa, but it's a very commonplace thing now. And whether you think there is something about the exterior architecture and seeing that as a machine being somehow more, I don't know, seeming more challenging or unwelcoming rather than an automated interior.
Yeah, I think it's about the exterior, both how it looks, but also how it's made, like the process of it being made and its performance overall. Actually, with more also in Denmark, their building walls are over 500 millimeters thick. And I had a one-in-one piece that I put together in my office, and he was laughing because it was 90 millimeters. So the performance, but then he says even those 500 millimeter thick walls, they've got triple glazed sliding doors, and more cold comes through the wall than through the window. So in terms of performance, there's a big range of how you can design the external envelope. But again, material use, embodied carbon, all that stuff comes into play. But there must be more efficient ways of doing that. But also there's often a lot of resistance in terms of client resistance to new technologies in terms of construction, especially the shells, kitchen appliances, kitchens, everything people are quite open to. But
isn't that, I just find that a strange observation that people are maybe more sensitive to those more external things rather than the internal appliances, highly technologized, datified products we use every day. Thanks.
Yeah.
Any further comments or questions? Oh, no. One more from Beth.
Sorry, Mike. I was interested in when you had this the slide with embodied time, embodied memory, and embodied carbon all together. And I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the connections amongst those three and or distinctions.
So embodied carbon, you obviously get embodied carbon, which is the material itself, then operational carbon, which is in its use, and whole life carbon. But so embodied carbon in the material. So obviously there's in a material like liquor bottle caps, for example, or in an existing building, there's embodied carbon embedded in it. But for many people, there's embedded meaning in those things. So artists who pick materials to make artwork from, like found objects or ready-mades, there's a fascination with the thing in and of itself, which triggers the imagination. So again, it's between the quantitative or carbon and the qualitative, which is maybe the embodied meaning. And then time relates to both of those because the meaning is often related to its former use or how people interacted with it previously versus what it is now or what it's becoming. So I think that three are sort of interrelated.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think that is there traction for that kind of thing? Because I mean, we see embodied carbon talked about an awful lot, right? And I think this is a really important shift to embrace, diverse ways of thinking about it, but also to open up to the more than human. So does that have traction in the fields that you're working in?
I guess I'm not sure I think it's getting there. So a lot of the writing is either quantitative.
Yeah,
there's a lot of
there's a division.
There's a division.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if it's necessarily being combined that often just yet. I'm sure it must have.
I think you're doing it, Mike, which is exciting. Yeah, no, I think that's right. That because there's so much of that technical specificity without the attending to those other aspects. Yeah, cool. Thank you.
I think we'll leave it there then. Please join me in thanking Mike for a great presentation.
Thanks.